During the dying days of the Great Crusade, as the warriors of the Space Wolves Legion invaded Prospero, the homeworld of the Thousand Sons Legion, the Primarchs Leman Russ and Magnus the Red would face off against one another in battle. Despite being a capable warrior in his own right, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons was unable to withstand the sheer bestial ferocity of the Wolf King, who ultimately bested Magnus in their duel. Before Russ could land the killing blow, however, Magnus, utilizing the body and mind of his first captain Azek Ahriman as a conduit, would cast a great spell that would result in the Thousand Sons escaping into the depths of the warp. While Russ believed that his brother had been torn apart by the storm of magical energies unleashed by the spell, Magnus still lived, at least in a sense. While his physical body had been destroyed, his soul persevered, though it had been shattered into countless different shards, with each shard seemingly representing a specific aspect of the Primarch's personality and character. Over time, the Thousand Sons would track down and recover many of these shards before merging them with the largest and most powerful of these fragments, one which was known simply as the Crimson King. Eventually, Magnus would learn that one of the final pieces of his fractured self was upon none other than the Imperial throne world of Terra. As the world was besieged by the forces of the traitorous war master Horus Lipical, Magnus, upon discovering an apparent gap within the psychic defenses of the Imperial palace, would concoct a plan to infiltrate the palace and reclaim this lost part of his soul. The Primarch, accompanied by a small number of his gene sons who had been psychically disguised as warriors from the Loyalist Blood Angels Legion, would make their way deep beneath the foundations of the palace towards the very heart of the Sanctum Imperialis, only to discover that Malcador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terra, alongside the perpetual Eliphusz Raker, had been expecting his arrival. The two would then engage in a surprisingly civilized conversation, with Malcador eventually revealing that the soul fragment that Magnus was after was no longer upon Terra, as it had been bonded to the Loyalist Thousand Son, Reviel Arvida, in an attempt to save his life from the effects of the flesh change, an act that would transform Arvida into an entity named Jiménez, who would go on to become the first Supreme Grand Master of the nascent Grey Knights. Enraged, Magnus would inadvertently kill the Sigillite, reducing his body to little more than a charred skeleton. While Ahriman suggested that they should withdraw, seeing as their objective was no longer obtainable, Magnus would ultimately disregard his first captain's proposal, for the Primarch realized that a new opportunity presented itself before them, a chance to kill the Emperor himself. Soon after this, Magnus and his entourage would encounter an avatar of the Emperor named Revelation, who, after escorting Magnus to the Emperor's throne room, would reveal that the Master of Mankind had deliberately engineered a gap within the psychic defenses of the palace in order to coax Magnus into meeting with him. Magnus would then destroy Revelation before ascending the steps leading up to the Golden Throne, ignoring the sounds of battle coming from below as his sons were attacked by a handful of Loyalist warriors from the Space Wolves and Salamander's legions. Yet, as Magnus prepared to slay his father, he was stopped by none other than his brother Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders. While Magnus expected his brother to attack him, Vulcan would greet him with both warmth and sorrow, saddened by the fact that they were now on opposing sides of the war. The Emperor would then speak to his wayward son, offering to forgive Magnus for his actions, using his powers to show the Primarch a vision of what would come to pass should he choose to abandon Horus's cause and return to his father's side. However, the Emperor then revealed that, while Magnus himself could find redemption, his legion could not, for thanks to the effects of the flesh change, the Thousand Sons were effectively damned. Instead, the Emperor would offer his son command of an entirely new legion, one comprised of warriors completely unlike those that had come before, as shown within the following quote from the novella Fury of Magnus.
"But I will build you a new legion, a mighty host of warriors greater than any now living. Plans are already in motion to bring about their inception. Soon, you will command warriors the likes of which the galaxy has never seen, whose flesh will be flawless, whose fists are steel, and whose hearts are armored in adamantium.
Despite this offer, Magnus vehemently refused to turn his back upon his gene sons, and in his anger and grief attempted to slay the Emperor once more, launching his staff like a harpoon, only for the weapon to be deflected by Vulcan. The two Primarchs would then engage one another in battle, with Magnus, thanks to his incredible psychic abilities, gaining the upper hand over his brother. But as Magnus prepared to strike Vulcan down, Barak Zaitos, one of Vulcan's Dragsword, would push his gene father out of the way, saving the Primarch's life, though at the cost of his own. Enraged by the death of his gene son, Vulcan would quickly overwhelm Magnus with sheer brute force, landing blow after blow against his brother, intent on beating the traitor to death. As he lay dying, Magnus would finally pledge himself to the Chaos God Tzeentch, who in turn would bless the Primarch with the gift of demonhood. However, thanks to the psychic barrier surrounding the Imperial Palace, which prevented demons from setting foot within its confines, Magnus would immediately be banished back into the warp. But one question from the series of events remains unanswered. Just what exactly was this new legion that the Emperor had offered to Magnus? The most likely possibility in this regard is that the Emperor had intended to place Magnus in command of the Grey Knights. The reasoning for this is that by the time the Siege of Terra had begun in earnest, the Emperor and Malcador had already laid the foundations for the modern-day Grey Knights chapter, with their numbers being drawn from the ranks of the Sigillites Knights Errant. In addition, the Grey Knights would certainly appear to fit the description of those warriors described by the Emperor, or at the very least from an initial standpoint. Not only is the gene seed of the Grey Knights noted to be exceptionally pure, similar to how the Emperor described the warriors of this new legion as having flawless flesh, but the Grey Knights are also known for their unparalleled spiritual purity, which can certainly be interpreted as the chapter's warriors having hearts that are proverbially armored in adamantium. While the Grey Knights are themselves commonly described as being a chapter, there is evidence to suggest that they were originally intended to be the 21st Legion of the Legiones Astartes. Prior to the onset of the Siege of Terra, as detailed within the novel The Buried Dagger, Malcador, after summoning those members of his Knights Errant that would go on to become the first Grand Masters of the Grey Knights, would explain that he intended for such warriors to not just build a chapter, but an entirely new legion, as shown within the following quote.
I will take you to build a legion. Not for this war. Not for any war that a common of mind can comprehend. You will be masters of a knightly order, to fight the war that never ends, in the realms beyond the real, and into the infernal.
Not only this, but the Grey Knights are known to share one key trait with the Thousand Sons, in that each of the chapter's warriors is a Psyker. However, unlike the warriors of the 15th Legion, who were shown to drastically vary in their levels of skill and power, every member of the modern-day Grey Knights chapter is known to demonstrate an exceptional degree of psychic potency. As such, it would make a degree of sense for the Emperor to entrust the most psychically gifted Primarch with an entire legion of warriors who are themselves powerful Psykers. Another possibility is that this new legion that the Emperor had offered to Magnus was intended to have been created utilizing the Primarch's own genetic material in a similar manner to how the original Thousand Sons Legion had been created. This would at first glance appear to be a somewhat reasonable assumption to make, for the initial gene seed stocks utilized by the Legiones Astartes were directly harvested from the DNA of their respective Primarchs. If a new legion were to be created utilizing gene seed drawn directly from Magnus himself, then this could theoretically mean that the curse of the flesh change would be absent from the warriors of this new, hypothetical legion. After all, the Emperor's Children Legion, prior to their reunion with their Primarch Fulgrim, would suffer from an affliction known as the Blight, resulting in many of the Legion's warriors suffering from extreme organ degradation as well as developing cancerous tumors. once the Legion was reunited with their gene father and fresh supplies of gene seed derived from Fulgrim's very DNA were created, the Blight would be effectively expunged from the Legion, although those warriors that had already been inducted into the Legion prior to this, such as Fabius Bile, would still be susceptible to its effects. Because of this, it's fair to assume that a similar such process can be undertaken in order to create gene seed stocks derived from Magnus the Red, which do not share the same defects as those currently found within the Thousand Sons Legion. After all, when the 15th Legion was initially founded, as detailed within the novel A Thousand Suns, there was a brief but intense resurgence of warpstorm activity within the boundaries of the Sol system. As such, while unconfirmed, it's possible that these warp storms could have tainted the gene seed stocks of the Thousand Sons from the outset, resulting in the development of the flesh change. If this were indeed the case, then this could also potentially mean that the genetic sequence of Magnus the Red was unaffected by such corruption, meaning that any Astartes whose gene seed was derived directly from Magnus himself would be unaffected by the flesh change. While the idea of Magnus being given an opportunity to, for lack of a better term, father an entirely new legion is certainly an interesting one, there are several problems with this particular possibility. The first, and most notable of which, is due to the flesh change itself. While the Emperor's children were able to rid themselves of the Blight, this was due to the fact that the Blight itself was not an inherent flaw within the Legion's gene seed, but one that had been artificially introduced by members of the Selenar gene cults who sought to rebel against the Imperium. By contrast, the flesh change appears to have been within the genetic sequence of the Thousand Sons since their very inception, with the first instances of the curse being documented as occurring just a mere 5 years after the onset of the Great Crusade. If the flesh change is in fact an inherent flaw found within the very genome of Magnus the Red, then there would appear to be no feasible way of expunging it from the Legion's gene seed. When Magnus met with the Emperor during the Siege of Terra, as detailed within the novella Fury of Magnus, the Emperor would go on to explain that neither he nor the Selenar gene cults, whose knowledge in the arts of genetic engineering and biological manipulation were even greater than his, were capable of curing the flesh change in any way, shape or form. It was this fact which would prompt the Emperor to gift Magnus with an entirely new legion to begin with, should the Primarch ever return to the Imperial fold. Indeed, as mentioned earlier, the Emperor would state that these new warriors, which he intended Magnus to lead, would have flesh that was flawless, a trait which is in itself in stark contrast to that of the Thousand Sons, with their flaw of the flesh change resulting in rampant and often fatal levels of mutation. Not only this, but the Emperor would also go on to explain that the plans to create this new legion were already in motion. If the Emperor had truly intended to create an entirely new legion derived from the gene line of Magnus, then this would appear to suggest that such plans could not be implemented until after Magnus had returned to the Loyalist cause, due to the fact that pre-existing stocks of Thousand Sons gene seed would have been tainted by the flesh change. As such, this would at first glance appear to rule out the possibility of this hypothetical 21st Legion being directly derived from Magnus the Red himself. But perhaps not, as there is one final possibility regarding this new Legion for Magnus to lead, in that the Legion in question was to be comprised entirely of Primaris Marines. Primaris Marines would certainly appear to fit the description of this new legion proposed by the Emperor, at least from an initial standpoint, for not only are they warriors of a kind never seen before, being far larger and stronger than a typical Astartes, but the Primaris genome is said to be far more stable and pure when compared to that of the older firstborn Marines, a trait which the Emperor himself could be alluding to when describing these hypothetical warriors as having flesh that is flawless. However, this does seem fairly unlikely, as the Primaris project itself would not be undertaken, at least not within any official capacity, until after the culmination of the Horus heresy and, more specifically, the recapturing of Luna, Terra's moon. During the events of the Solar War, the conflict that directly preceded the Siege of Terra, Luna would be captured and subsequently turned into a staging ground for traitor Legion forces. It was here upon Luna, as detailed within the novella Sons of the Selenar, that the Sancprimus Portum, an artifact that not only contained within it pure and untainted genetic samples from all 20 of the Primarchs, but would also serve as the very foundation for the entire Primaris project, was located. While a small ragtag group of loyalists would manage to prevent the traitors from obtaining the Sancprimus Portum for themselves, the artifact itself would remain lost until after the events of the Horus heresy, as the Raven Guard warrior Nikona Sharoken would go into hiding with the device within an abandoned deep space coaling station before subsequently falling into a Suzan membrane coma. It wouldn't be until after the onset of the Great Scouring that Rabute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines Legion, would obtain and entrust the Sancprimus Portum to Belisarius Cawl, who in turn, at Guilliman's behest, would use the artifact to create a newer, more powerful breed of Astartes as part of a contingency plan that the Primarch had devised to aid the Imperium in its darkest hour. As such, it does seem incredibly unlikely that the Emperor's proposed legion for Magnus would be comprised of Primaris Marines, as one of, if not the most necessary component that led to their creation would not be reacquired by the Imperium until long after the Siege of Terra. But all of this speculation may very well be for naught, for according to Vulcan, as detailed within the novel Echoes of Eternity, Magnus's encounter with the Emperor did not happen the way Magnus remembered it, and that no offer was ever made to forgive the Primarch, nor bestow him with an entirely new legion of warriors, and that it was instead Magnus who had come before the Emperor begging for forgiveness, only to be rebuked and driven off. But whether this statement from Vulcan is in fact the gospel truth, or if his own memories of those events had been clouded by his emotions, rewritten by the Emperor himself, or that the Lord of Drakes was simply lying to his brother in order to gain a psychological advantage during their battle within the Webway, remains unknown. Regardless as to what the Emperor may or may not have intended for Magnus, such plans would never come to fruition. Indeed, because the Primarch had chosen to pledge his heart and very soul to one of the Chaos Gods, resulting in his ascension to demonhood, it would appear that Magnus had lost his one and only chance to find redemption. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching!